morning, everyone. My name is Randy Bell. I'm the director of the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center. On behalf of the Atlantic Council, it's my pleasure to welcome our distinguished guests, Mr. David Eyton, the head of technology at BP, and Ms. Carol Battershell, the principal deputy director in the Office of Policy at the U.S. Department of Energy, for our event this morning, Transformations in Energy Technology, Innovations for a Secure Energy Future. And we're very happy we're hosting David again. We hosted him 2 years ago now. So was it 3? Might have been 3. So we're very, very happy that you're back here. And it's very great to meet Carol this morning. The energy mix is, of course, changing very rapidly, increasing energy demand around the world, and international consensus about the need for low-carbon energy sources present new opportunities and challenges for energy consumers and producers alike. The profound transformation in the energy industry will be powered by an equally important transformation in energy technology. From efficiency to storage to digitization to emissions reduction, innovation in energy technology will prove critical to meeting both expected energy demand growth and the goals laid out by the Paris Agreement, while providing new opportunities for those seeking to take the lead in the global energy transition. These opportunities are what bring us here today. Drawing from the analysis provided in BP's Technology Outlook 2018, David Eyton will kick us off with remarks about how technology is changing the way energy will be produced and consumed. And I should also mention that given BP's leadership in not only evaluating the future of the energy innovation landscape, also pushing the needle on these new technologies such as CCS and solar development, we also are looking forward to David's perspective on how these technologies are being deployed in the field. Then we'll hear from Carol Battershell, who, given her leadership of DOE's work on energy innovation, will provide us with unique insight into how the United States is aiming to take advantage of the opportunities of new technology. And Carol was also with BP for many years, coincidentally, so it's sort of a BP technology reunion here today. And then we'll have a moderated discussion with Ambassador Richard Morningstar, who I think you all know and love. He'll be up here in a little bit to moderate the discussion. So we're thankful both to have David and Carol with us this morning, and it's just great to have BP as such a close partner. And I'd like to remind you this conversation is on the record. Please follow along on Twitter. Our account is at AC Global Energy, and use the hashtag AC Energy. And with that, please, David, join us up on stage.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to be back in DC again and to share with you the highlights of the publication that we have just launched in March. This is a partner publication to the BP Energy Outlook, which we have produced on an annual basis. The last time we published this was 3 years ago, and an awful lot has happened, frankly, in 3 years since we published the previous Technology Outlook. Just to be clear, I mean, these aren't forecasts. They are an analysis of the way in which we think that technology trends that are emerging in the world can impact the world's energy systems, in particular the merit order in different sectors in the world's energy systems. It's a solidly techno-economic analysis. It does not include the impacts of social preferences. It does not presume what people will do in terms of policies. It does take some account, however, of the natural resources that different parts of the world have. So anyway, I will try and share with you this analysis and then look forward to your questions. If I just go to the first slide here, what this shows is what has changed and what has not changed since the last time I spoke to you here at the Atlantic Council and we published our Outlook. What has not changed is the fact that we still think that the world has abundant energy resources. We still think that the choices that people will make around the world can vary by region. We still see that it's been much easier to decarbonize the power sector than it is transport, or in particular the heat and industrial sector. And we still see that digital technologies are going to change radically the way in which we produce and consume energy in the world. That's unchanged, and that's what I said last time. What has, on the other hand, changed is that some things have moved faster than we thought they would over the last 3 years. In fact, the analysis we published in 2015 was based upon more like 2012 vintage data. So it's a slightly longer period that this reflects. But nonetheless, batteries have come down in cost much faster than we expected. Renewable solar, in particular, has come down faster. Less so wind, but certainly solar has come down faster than expected. And the performance of the unconventionals, gas in particular, has improved faster than expected. expected. So what we've done this time around is looked more closely at some aspects of the world's energy systems and then built that into our thinking and updated it. And what I'm going to do is run through, firstly, resources, and focus on oil and gas. That's our area of particular interest, but also where things noticeably have changed, and then move into sort of more different use cases in the power, transport, and heating sectors. This, by the way, just shows you how much we think that the costs have come down in terms of prices per doubling of batteries, wind, and solar. With solar coming down the fastest at roughly 23%, I think it is, per doubling, and then wind at about 19% per doubling, and batteries at about 16% per doubling in the volume of these devices that we have in the world. So those are the kinds of assumptions built into this analysis. So going firstly to resources. We've done updated analysis, and effectively all that we've done is added 200 billion barrels equivalent on a global basis associated with the unconventional play that's obviously very, very potent here in America, but now transferring to other parts of the world like Argentina and China and places. So what you see on this graph here is the belief that we have that you can extract out of discovered fields, oil and gas fields today, 4.9 trillion barrels of oil and gas equivalent using today's technology. If you then look forward out to 2050, which is the period of this analysis, what you see is that both a combination of new discoveries can add something like 750 billion barrels of oil and gas equivalent, and then the advances in technology we expect over that period can also add a large amount of oil and gas, which is 1.8 trillion barrels of oil and gas equivalent, giving you a grand total of roughly 7.5 trillion. And that compares with a prospective demand between now and 2050 of something in the range of 1.8 to 2.5 trillion barrels of oil and gas equivalent, depending upon whether you're in a 2-degree scenario at the low end of that spectrum or more a unconcerned about carbon scenario at the high end of that spectrum. And obviously that says to you, well, in that case we've got a lot of resources in theory, and actually that's always been the case, and that remains the case. There's a lot of oil and gas underground. Factors other than the technical capability to extract it will determine whether or not it is actually extracted. But I think the important point to make is that even at the lower, the IEA estimates that under their new policy scenario, which is somewhere in the middle of this range, it will cost something like $600 billion per annum over at least the next 2 decades to supply the demand that exists. You probably would be looking at something like, the 500 billion a year over this period to hit the lower end of that spectrum, and maybe a bit more than 600 billion a year to hit the higher end. But this is nevertheless a very large amount of investment that's going to be required under any scenario, including climate concern scenarios. You also might ask the question, well, why bother to explore if you've got all this resource underground? And the answer is that you can find much more economic resources and less environmentally damaging resources by exploration, which will substitute some of these resources in terms of the priority of development. That was a small amount about resources. Clearly there's lots and lots of sun and wind and wave and geothermal and nuclear, etc. in the world as well. In fact, there's probably more than an order of magnitude more potential energy resources in the world that could be tapped out to 2050 than we need. So I won't go into that in any great detail. What I will do now is turn to the power sector. And I will show you a number of analyses here which may look quite complex, but they're actually ordered from left to right in terms of what we think could be the cheapest form of whatever we're talking about on the left-hand side and the most expensive on the right-hand side. These are all pre-cost analysis. This is actually an analysis of North American power in 2050, and the little shaded grey bar you can see hiding there is actually a 2015 data point. And this is assuming a $4 per million BTU gas price in America. It ignores production tax credits, all that kind of stuff, pre-tax analysis. And the big message that you might reasonably draw from this analysis is that wind, onshore wind, is increasingly the one to beat. Now what we've done is layered on top of the green bars, which is the actual cost of the wind turbine in this case, we've layered on top of that the cost of managing intermittency. And what you can see that the orange and the blue bars sitting on top of that, we've also layered on top of this a cost of carbon. And we've assumed $100 a tonne notionally in 2050. It's not to say that's the right number, that's just what we've assumed in this analysis. And what you can conclude from that is that wind power, there's a growing cost as it increases in the system. If 75% of all the power in America were provided by wind, there would be a high cost of managing that intermittency. Actually, the cost of managing intermittency in solar power is higher than the cost of managing intermittency in wind power, for the fairly simple reason that you can guarantee the sun won't be shining when you most need it at 6 o'clock in the evening on Christmas Eve, whereas the wind might be blowing. And if you look across the page, what you can see is that this analysis suggests that renewable power will increasingly provide energy power when the resources are available, but natural gas is a very natural backup for that, especially in the USA where the prices are comparatively low, and that if you increase the price of natural gas to the price on carbon to $100 a ton, you can afford to decarbonize that natural gas, and it then, decarbonized natural gas, provides the natural backup for renewable power. So something of a changing of the guard here, with renewables coming to the fore and natural gas helping them into the system and providing flexibility in the system. That's power. You can look more closely at intermittency, and this sort of demonstrates the point. This is a notional southern US state. It shows how power demand goes up and down during a week. And you can see how natural gas in particular is providing very significant flexibility. It's almost turning on and off on a daily basis, and that's a very, very challenging demand for power operators to supply. And one of the big issues that I think regulators face, you mentioned the possibility of talking about this, Randy, is that how do you incentivize power producers to provide that kind of backup and to compensate them for the flexibility that they're going to show? So that's the challenge, if you like, in balancing power systems. And on this graph, we've also put in a dotted line there, which is actually when you can move demand to, if you put in some kind of demand supply side response to the supply you've got. So anyway, that's that one there. And if you look at in terms of energy storage, people often ask about, well, can't batteries just provide the backup? Just charge up batteries and then when you need the power, use it. And the problem with that is that the longer you want to store power for, the more expensive it gets. It rises, directly in line with the amount of time you want to store it for. And the challenge is that you have to store energy almost interseasonally in order to be able to balance power systems, especially in the Northern Hemisphere. And so storing energy for a few hours, batteries are very good at short-term storage, providing frequency and inertia support for systems and very rapid response. But they become quite bad at storing power for any particularly long length of time, more than about 6 hours. And so what you see is if you peaking, yes, they can compete. Balancing, this is in 2050, this analysis, balancing much more difficult to store energy, store power for a long time, and you need something else. And actually natural gas is still highly competitive at providing these longer term balancing services in the power system. If I turn now to transport, again ordered from left to right, with the most cost-effective in 2050 on the left and the least cost-effective on the right. And I would emphasize this is today's paradigm. This is with cars driving maybe 20,000 kilometers in a year, having a range of at least 300 kilometers. This assumes a $75 a barrel oil price. The same assumptions there for carbon price, but there's a different character in this one here. For starters, the upfront capital cost of these vehicles is overwhelmingly the big choice you make in terms of the cents per kilometer that it's going to cost you to travel. And you've got all the drive lines across the bottom here, the engine systems. But I would say, looking at this, certainly from where I'm standing right now, you could say, well, they're pretty much all the same, aren't they? They're pretty close to being the same. There's a real convergence here. And one could argue about whether or not people make choices as to what car they'll purchase today solely on the basis of cost. I'm not sure they do. But certainly looking in the future, it doesn't look as though cost is going to be the major determinant in terms of which vehicle you buy. Electric vehicles clearly can compete in this time frame with the battery prices coming down. Our assumption is to $50 a kilowatt hour for a 65 kilowatt hour pack in a mid-sized saloon in 2050. And other ones there, obviously, are all pretty close. The thing to note, however, here is that I think other things are going to drive choices in this sector. For example, utilization. If you were to utilize an electric vehicle for 50% of the time today, rather than the 5% of the time in this one here, that changes it completely. It becomes much more cost-effective to use something with a low cost of energy, i.e. electricity, rather than a high cost of energy, i.e. fuels. So 50% utilization, you probably find that electric vehicles were competitive today. Certainly two-wheelers are pretty competitive even today if you want to electrify them. So utilization makes a big difference in this one here. Then when you add together the combinations of autonomy, ride sharing and electrification, there's an added multiplier effect there of making it more cost effective to have mobility as a service. So this is one paradigm. There are other paradigms I could put up, but this shows you that even under this paradigm, electric vehicles can compete in the 2050 timeframe. You then find yourself having to deal with other issues, which is how do you supply power to a system in which it's not a few percentage points, but many tens of percentage points of electric vehicles in the system. And that is an overwhelmingly different challenge for energy suppliers like BP. And the last comment I'd make here is that it's probable that in somewhere like China, the major driver for this switch towards zero emissions vehicles is air quality in cities. But one has to be careful about the provenance of air quality. If you take London, for example, 2/3 of the pollution in London comes from outside London. So whatever you do inside London doesn't necessarily help if you don't address what happens outside London. And even from within London, 1/3 of the particulates, so 2/3 of the particulates that you find coming in there, I think, 1/3 of them is actually from tyres and brakes. So you won't get rid of the particulates associated with tyres and brakes if you change the engine in the vehicle. So a lot of things matter in understanding the provenance of air quality. Biofuels in this time frame can also compete, and you don't have to therefore have a zero carbon fuel system in order for it not to impact carbon in the atmosphere. You can move towards biofuels, which are a renewable carbon, and in this time frame we see them as being able to compete. This one shows a combination of the carbon from combustion as well as the carbon from the fuel from the manufacturer as well. I won't dwell on that one, we can come back to it. What I really wanted to say is that as you get bigger and heavier and want to go further and higher, electrification becomes increasingly challenging. And in fact, probably air transport is the most onerous of all the demands. Very difficult indeed to see how that you will have air transport being done on something like batteries because of the weight of the batteries. The energy density of batteries is still something like 1/100th that of the energy density in a hydrocarbon fuel. If you look at, just checking here, yes, I've got heavy duty and light duty trucks here. And what you can see is that lighter duty trucks probably can be electrified as well in this time frame. But as you get to heavier duty trucks, it is extremely difficult to imagine that you'll carry your energy around with you in the form of a battery. In fact, it looks as though in this time, up to reasonably high prices of carbon of $100 a ton, that natural gas can become increasingly competitive in transport. And I simply note that LNG trucking, particularly in China, is growing at a very, very high rate. I believe the number was 500% growth in 1 year last year. So you can see a possible changing of the guard in transportation here. The pantograph case in the heavy-duty truck is actually overhead electric cables, which is probably not a normal one. The batteries just didn't work there, so we came up with a case that showed how you could possibly introduce electric transport into heavier-duty trucking. So now turning to the heating sector, the last of the sectors I was going to talk about. Unlike the previous graphs, which showed a changing of the guard, a new kid on the block that can compete with today's dominant form of energy supply, heating sector actually doesn't really seem to show that. Today, condensing gas boilers are about the cheapest way to deliver heat to people, and it looking out to 2050 with the assumptions we've made here, that they still probably could be the most competitive. And there's a simple reason for that, and that is that if you want to deliver energy at a very, very high rate, for example, for boiling or even in industrial uses like metals processing or manufacturing cement, natural gas delivers a very, very high form of heat, and it's very difficult to substitute that with an electric solution. So it's hardly surprising that you see much the same ordering here as you do today in 2050. Which is because of the importance of both energy density and the ability to deliver energy at a very, very high rate. You can see beginnings of hybrid electric pump systems beginning to penetrate in the time frame of 2050, but it's still not the cheapest at $100 a ton. And I would also say that if one's concern is carbon dioxide in the residential system, then in the industrial system, then it is quite important to make sure that you attack pure sources of CO2. And you get pure sources of CO2 coming off a number of these processes, most notably the cement process, and it would be cost effective to capture and inject that CO2 in the ground at a comparatively low price on carbon. So my penultimate slide says that what happens when you build all these assumptions into a regional model, which we've done for the major regions of the world, and we've done it in this case here for China, and say, well, what happens to the what you're using today, and then whether they will drop out of the system, go below 10% of the sector, or rise into the system, go above 10%. And you can see a very, very significant shift if you put a carbon budget onto the Chinese energy system, in this case in 2050. And what you see is coal dropping out of the system significantly in order to manage carbon, and you see many new technologies, in fact all of wind, solar, nuclear and bioenergy, all under this model assumption with our costs put into it, all get to above 10% of the energy system in power in China, with nuclear actually being the largest, because unlike one of the first analysis I showed you, nuclear power in China is probably less than half the cost of nuclear power in America, because they do it as a series of modules rather than as one-offs, and that makes a big difference. You see a big change of the guard also in transport and heating. And interestingly, although the starting point is very different in China, when you look at the end point, you reach quite similar endpoints in most regions of the world in terms of the makeup of the mix when it's purely techno-economically optimized. So in conclusion, what we think can change the game in the world through to 2050 is the combination of 4 technologies and 1 system action. The 4 technologies are the growing use of and reducing the cost of renewable power and of batteries, which can transform the power system and transform lighter duty transport. Furthermore, we see significant opportunities to optimize and make more efficient the world's energy systems through the application of digital technologies. And then lastly, we think that it's going to be extremely difficult to balance, in particular, power systems in the world, but also, frankly, heavier duty transport and heating if you don't have some kind of way of decarbonizing natural gas. Effectively carry on using the same natural gas systems we have today, but deliver energy through it without fossil carbon in it. And then the last one, which is not really a technology, but is a system action, is energy efficiency. Something like 80+% of the energy capped at source in the world does not turn up in useful heat, light, motion, and materials. It is wasted in that system from converting from one form of energy to another, and eventually end use. And that's largely in the form of low-grade heat. Something like 40% of that is probably tractable as a target for improvement in energy efficiency in the world's energy systems, and that, generally speaking, requires us as individuals to change the way in which we behave, the temperature at which we run our house, how many people we travel with, etc. And so that really is a significant policy challenge, and our view is that putting a system like price on carbon can help with that, because if you look at the price on carbon in different parts of the energy system around the world, they vary hugely. That's not economically efficient, and many components of the energy system have no effective carbon price imputed them whatsoever. So those are the main conclusions we draw, and I look forward to engaging with you in conversations about that after I think Carol has spoken. Thank you very much indeed.
There's some seats up here for, a bunch of seats if people want to come around.
Okay. So, I had not seen David's last slide, but in fact, it's an excellent segue to to my first slide? Okay, well, not that one, but the one I'm going to show in a minute. His last slide talked about that technology is key, but that consumer choice and policy are also important in the equation. And I was going to start with a bit on how complex and interrelated technology markets and policy are. And basically what we find, and both BP and the Department of Energy and many others look at how to estimate the future and realizing that you really need to look at all of these. And as you look at it, you find that basically everything influences everything. And looking at future estimates of technology costs, the market development, uptake of technology, and the policy changes are all important. BP and DOE have somewhat different perspectives on each of these, but we also have different degrees of influence in the different elements, and that's the other thing that I wanted to talk about a bit. Again, in the similarities, I have, as we mentioned in the introduction, worked in both BP and in DOE, so I'm familiar with BP doing a technology outlook, and DOE every 4 years does a quadrennial technology review. Also, DOE has a BP Energy Outlook, and inside DOE there's an Energy Information Administration, and they also do an annual Energy Outlook, which is more the market side, supply and demand. And again, looking at technology markets and policy, there have been a couple instances where DOE also wrote a policy review. So looking at all of those together. The BP Technology Review might be a combination a little bit of the Quadrennial Technology Review that the DOE does and some of our energy forecasting. Our Quadrennial Technology Review actually does not look at predicting what's likely to happen with the technologies and the costs. It looks more at identifying what promising R&D there is. And as I mentioned before, I spent the majority of my career in industry, in BP, 25 years. My first job in the government was at the interface between industry and government, particularly in technology commercialization. So coming into government with an industry background, I found myself asking myself a lot, what's the legitimate role of government here? To make sure that I understood. I knew what industry was supposed to do, but I was trying to make sure I was knowing what a legitimate government space was. And the QTR, in its role to identify promising technology for R&D, is one of those, I feel, legitimate government roles, especially when you apply the lens of which of these technologies are in the national interest. National interests like it's important to the nation or security, but industry or academia aren't going to invest in these because they're too risky or aren't investing in them at the pace that we think, that the government thinks is important for the national interest. And another thing that guided me on what's in the national or what's the federal role is what does legislation say we're supposed to be doing. Now, DOE invests billions a year in R&D, and I think that that's actually the part of the energy side of the Department of Energy that most people are familiar with, so that's actually not what I'm going to talk about, which technologies we spend how much money on. Instead, I'm going to spend some time talking about, other than the level of investment, the billions of dollars, what DOE does to incentivize and try to keep innovation going in the nation that we think is a competitive advantage for the U.S., as well as commercializing. When we invest a lot in these technologies, they don't do a lot of good just sitting in the labs. We want them to be out in the market. I mentioned that legislation, by definition, is a we're directed to do particular things, and there are, I'm not going to go through each of these, but there are a number of different pieces of legislation that say commercialization and innovation are roles of the government. Generally, what they all push towards is a mandate for open access to the national labs, both the research and the resources that are there. For example, the Bayh-Dole Act in 1980 was about having not-for-profits be able to obtain titles to inventions that were funded with federal money. Both in 86 and 89, there were two complementary laws that talked about that not-for-profits could do cooperative research agreements and work together with the innovators at the labs. And then there was technology in 1995, the National Technology Transfer and Advancement Act, that talked about assuring that companies that did this cooperative research with the government would get sufficient intellectual property in those investments to justify them doing something to commercialize the technologies. So there's different stages of innovation. They start from basic science, move to applied science, engineering, and serial production. There's early discovery and more emphasis in energy in the industry on near-term solutions that they can make money off of. And while this particular drawing was drawn by a lab director, it might slightly oversize the national lab role there in the middle, just a little bit, but it does put it in the right spot on the spectrum and emphasizes that high complexity, multidisciplinary, long time horizon are the types of things that the government invests in and thinks that they need to invest in because it doesn't fit particularly well other places. There are also other players in this middle space that is designated national labs on this graph, and startups and VCs play a role in there as well. Not only, as I mentioned before, does the government fund research, and a lot of it goes through these national labs, but we're also looking at the labs to encourage innovation. And perhaps the most direct way that they help with innovation is they're a home for science-based innovators. Again, the most direct way is that the national labs employ a lot of scientists. People might not be familiar with the operating model for the national labs, but they're actually government contractors. So that allows the labs more flexibility to hire world-class scientists. They can pay different salaries than the federal scale, and that has proven to be a good model. And we wanted to find, though, other ways to use the labs to support innovators. And one of the ways that we have been looking at is to have a way to bring other innovators for short-time assignments or roles inside the government. And we call that one a lab-embedded entrepreneurship program, because, we're not that great at titles. What it does is recruit some of the best energy innovators, and then it allows really good leverage with the world-class research facilities and mentors that we have at the labs, and it positions, it brings in innovators to take some of the lab technology and commercialize it. That, again, being trying to get it out of the labs and into the market. So we've got 3 of these. We started the first one in California, and it's called Cyclotron Road. It is started in 2014. We also have subsequent ones that we started in Illinois with Argonne Lab and my alma mater, Purdue, and one in Tennessee called Innovation Crossroads. And again, these bring some entrepreneurs. We've worked with 39 of these entrepreneurs so far to bring them into the laboratories, and some of the successes at Cyclotron Road, just the first group of innovators that came in, catalyzed over $15 million of private investments and research funding and created 30 high-tech manufacturing jobs that were started by these innovators. And in 2016, a total of 7 of the innovators in these programs were named to Forbes' prestigious 30 Under 30 list in the energy category. So we're particularly proud of that. The National Lab System, for those that aren't familiar with it, and I was not when I started, there are exceedingly impressive facilities that I went around and visited, great innovators, great technology inventions, but there's a lot of them. There is not a way to say, I want to talk to the national labs, and I want to talk about this technology. There is not a clear way to know, like, who works on solar, and you'll get an answer of like 7 labs. And the labs, because of this model I talked about, that they're contractors to the labs, they act independently, and sometimes probably through the actions of the government and how we treat them, they act a bit competitively with each other. And they also, if you try to interact with them, maybe you've had a successful partnership at one lab and you go to another lab and figure it'll be the same process. It won't be. And then the geography of the labs, they're dispersed across the nation, and in fact, some of them are literally hidden because of their heritage with the Manhattan Project. You were not going to stumble across Los Alamos or Oak Ridge. Los Alamos, there's these finger canyons, and it's hidden in one of those, and the rolling hills of Tennessee hide Oak Ridge fairly well. So what are we going to do about that? And to be fair, this characterization of how to interact with them is something that we have been working on for some time, and is better than it has been. When I started about 10 years ago and was trying to commercialize technology and get it out of the labs, I remember meeting with a number of labs and asking questions like, you know, again, I'm trying to understand the government, and I'm like, how do you market the technologies? And again, to be fair to the labs, that's not really what the world-class scientists do, is market things. And so I'm like, how do you make these available to industry? And they're like, well, whenever anyone comes here, we will tell them all about it. I'm like, so how would they know where to come? And so we started something, I think about 9 years ago, took a year or so to get started. Seemed kind of basic to me, seemed kind of out of the box in the government, but what we came up with was, how about we take all the inventions that all the labs have done, put them in one place on this thing called the web, and people could go in and search for the kind of technology they were interested in, and how do you let them know what you have available? And again, it was like, well, we'll explain it to them when they come here and ask us about it. And the other thing that we wanted to do was write up, like, what would this technology be good for? So we have the technology portal now, which has over 20,000 patents and applications that you can go and search. But again, those probably aren't great marketing documents. So we've also gotten the labs to write more than 1,200 of these one-page, what would this technology be good for, marketing sheets. And we have quite a number of successes out of having this type of interface. And in fact, it's now already moving into its next generation incarnation that will be even better for how to interact with the labs. It's going to be called the Lab Partnering Service. and I should have put its URL on there as well. It's www.labpartnering.org, and it takes some of the work for the investors out of the equation and will connect them right away on the internet with a subject matter expert that knows the lab system and can kind of guide them through and help them with what technology they might be looking for. So that's one example of what we've been trying to do to help connect the government innovations with the market investors. Another thing that we're trying and is started under this administration is how about we bring all the people that are interested in a particular technology, and we're starting the first one with energy storage, to one of the laboratories, talk about just one technology and bring in industry that may be interested in that, VC, private equity, small startups, as well as the government experts in this area. We've got about 10 labs that are participating in this, and the idea is to have quarterly summits like this on a various topics. Like I said, the first one is in September and is on energy storage, but they're already starting to talk about additional topics, and we think the next ones may be AI and advanced computing, or advanced manufacturing, and that was about all I was going to share about energy innovation as a complement to what BP was talking about on particular technologies that are moving along. Okay.
Well, thank you very much, both David and Carol. Those were really both, I think, very excellent presentations. I do want to say right at the outset that it's really a shame that Dan Jurgen isn't here, because totally randomly, David and I are wearing the same ties from the Sarah conference. And David Livingston, who's our director for our environmental programs and deputy director of the center, doesn't have his tie on today. So.
I was at Sarah. I did not get a tie.
Did not give you a scarf.
Let me start off by asking a few questions. First, David, prices are increasing. Oil prices are increasing. Maybe they'll increase even more after 2 o'clock this afternoon when President Trump makes a statement on the Iran nuclear deal. What effect, if any, does present pricing have on BP's investment in new technologies and looking at where the company may be 20, 30, 40 years from now? Is it relevant at all? Or is this something that could, if prices continue to increase, could create a disincentive with respect to new technologies?
So I think the simple answer is it doesn't make a lot of difference unless what's going on today we think has strategic significance for the long term. The investment we make in technology is generally targeting a period up to 10, 20 years out. And so if the reason for which prices are moving today we think could also impact the world 10, 20 years out, then yes, in theory it could impact it. But I would say, broadly speaking, the price goes up and down every single day, and we can't afford to change our technology programs every single day because of that.
Let me go focus a little bit on what I thought, Carol, you made a really an excellent presentation. The DOE ought to have you as a permanent roadshow. Not that you would want to do that, but I think you explained really well the kinds of things that DOE does. So I guess a couple of questions. One, from your standpoint, David, where do you see the role of government and cooperation between companies and governments with respect to new technologies? And how do you see, have you had any experience with DOE and U.S. laboratories, and can they play a role? Do you see differences between what's taking place in Europe and what's taking place in the United States from a government standpoint? And then, Carol, what about cooperation with European researchers? You know, we've had the US-EU Energy Council, which has, I think, been pretty much inactive as part of this administration. From the European, it was in Europe, it was called the EU-US Energy Council, but that's another. But in any event, is there cooperation with labs in Europe, and should there be more? And also generally, can government really play a role, or is it all market driven? And where do you, and both of you, where do you see the cooperation? I think you've really spoken to that already, Carol, but I'll ask both of you to look at sort of that series of questions.
You want to go first?
I will go first. Actually, I might answer a little bit first from my BP role. I did not work at all with the government laboratories until I was in a job where I had the lead for the global hydrogen and fuel cell programs. And at that point, we applied for a couple grants with the federal government and won them. I'll have to say two interesting things. When I moved out to manage the office where I was had gotten the grants from, they knew me as a difficult person to interact with because I negotiated kind of hard. But the difficult part from the BP side was that it was during a time of earmarks, and we would win a particular grant, and then it would get a lot smaller because a lot of the money had been earmarked. And so I'm sure I was difficult because we had scheduled a program for a certain amount of money, and then half of the money went away, and we had ongoing conversations about how big does the grant need to be from the government, or how, as it decreases, when is it just not worth the trouble to continue interacting, because it was a complex relationship. But it enabled us to work with some other industry partners because they were a mediator. So we found that valuable because we interacted with Ford and Chrysler in a way that would have been more difficult on our own. So some value, but definitely some edge on it, I found from the government side, but largely irrelevant and unknown until I was in a very specific technology role. Now, from the government side, I've certainly used that experience to try to make it less troublesome to deal with, but I think that there is an important role for the government, certainly on the investments that they do in new technologies, or particularly capital-intensive technologies that industry is not investing in as much. We used to have much bigger industry labs. They are substantially smaller now. And so I do see that as a very important role to continue those types of investments. And it takes a long time, but there have been dramatic successes. A lot of the fracking technology available now started with some government research projects, certainly picked up by the industry and brought to fruition, but started with some long-term government research.
What about cooperation with European labs?
I don't think we do direct collaboration with the European labs. We do, the labs will take European-owned companies that have U.S. operations, well, like BP, that applied for labs, but we also have cooperative agreements with folks like Vestas and some of the other foreign-owned companies, but less collaboration with the other labs. These are seen as national competitive advantage, and I don't think there's a big...
We tried hard. I remember when I was back in the government to get through that council to have more cooperation, but it just never seemed to work for some reason. What's your reaction, David, to dealing with labs? What governments can do, or should governments just stay out of things? And if you think that governments should be involved, particularly in the research area, where do you think that work could be the most fruitful at this point?
Well, I really like Carol's slide, the one with the possibly overstated, but the two declining industry fundamental research and the labs in the middle. Actually, this problem is a problem that every single nation that I interact with around the world wrestles with. The bit in the middle is basically the valley of death.
Yes, basically.
And getting, especially capital-intensive technologies through the valley of death is extremely hard. If I could compare and contrast slightly, you have the Chinese system, for example, in which pretty much all the major labs were sort of part of one system, and so they didn't really have this problem. And they took prototypes right the way through to late stages, and you can go to these places in China and you can see massive engines or massive pieces of kit which have been built by the research establishment. So they dealt with it. But now, because the system is changing somewhat there, they're wrestling with the same issue as how do they reach out to and interact with industry. These labs which just used to look upwards and do much more of a state-sponsored activity. So they're wrestling with how to build the interfaces you're talking about. In Europe, calibration is pretty tricky. It's quite complicated and bureaucratic, at least within Europe. But I would say, with the probable exception of Germany, that there isn't much that sits in the middle there. Certainly in the UK, this is a major challenge, which is translation of great research into commercial products. And a lot of work is being done by the joint academies there to think about exactly what to put in the middle. And they don't have national labs, for example, in the UK, so they're lacking that function and that capability. In the US, I think that the national lab system you have here is a fabulous capability and asset base.
It really is.
Unparalleled. And I've certainly known that we've worked with Sandia, Slack, LBNL, Oak Ridge as BP, and we're targeted in terms of what we want to work on, but they're brilliant people with whom to work. If you're very clear as a company going to them, this is where we really need help, then they sure know how to solve problems, which are quite practical, mission-oriented, business-related problems, but you just need to bring the best people to bear on it. Often getting access to a synchrotron or something. We don't have one of those in our backyard as BP.
It is not just the innovators, but these world-class research facilities, user facilities, and the model is, we build things that industry can't afford to all have their own, and then we make them open access to folks. You have to compete for time on them and sometimes pay for it, but certainly cheaper than trying to build your own accelerators.
I think the challenge that you have, and actually to some extent I find myself communicating with governments as well, is that it's not really helping the big companies to do this that is the trick. Because a big company like mine, we can go figure out which of the valleys one of these labs are in, and we can go work with them. It's almost an advantage we have because we've got the resources to figure out how to interface with these massive, great big institutions and their capabilities. It's actually small companies that just don't have the resources to go search all this stuff and go figure out who they really need to work with. And I think lots of governments are busy trying to figure out how it is that they can provide ways to support smaller companies to engage also in this system so they can be more successful, not just big companies. I think that's a real challenge.
And to be clear, while I didn't emphasize it a lot in the presentation, a lot of these things really are aimed at smaller companies who don't have the resources, and bringing them together in a forum to be able to see all of those folks so they don't have to travel to each lab is more economic for them, and we do think a lot about the startups and the entrepreneurs.
Good. We'll sort of go back and forth with the audience, and then maybe have more dialogue up here as well. But Ambassador Kozlerich had a question or a comment.
Rich Kozlerich from George Mason University. I'm co-director of the Center on Energy Science and Policy, and we have had such a great relationship with Sandia Labs and the university. Kind of proves
Good to hear.
that you were making. But two things, as a newcomer to the academic world, has come out of foreign policy that has struck me. One, the problem of stovepiping on the academic side, the real challenge, and where a program that we've worked with Sandia on resilience has come in, is to cross those disciplinary silos and allow the kind of collaboration that really is critical, I think. So, developing a relationship like that, in our case, is really, really important. So thanks for that. The second thing is, and we sort of focus on kind of the macro level, high value added aspects of this. And I know both BP as a company and DOE as a government organization get involved in this, but we really should pay attention to the undergraduate students who are the most enthusiastic I've found, working on energy-related issues, and we're struggling to find a way to really engage them more, because intuitively they know where the future lies and they want to go for it. And they don't see their undergraduate training as simply training to go into graduate school. They want to find some practical applications, and they're really involved, especially on renewables. So it's something I think to think about for the future.
I think that's fair. We have a number of the laboratories have a number of very good programs for high school students, and I can't remember what it's called, something Science Bowl, and we do some competitions and some exposure to the labs, and we have excellent programs for graduate students, particularly postdocs, who can spend time or get jobs at the lab. But I think you're right that undergraduate, we don't have maybe the same robust programs for.
If I could just add a comment, which is that this is a big issue in many parts of the world. Not all, but many. Just attracting a diverse group of students into science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and supporting them through that system. And I think the challenge is for this not to be a competitive process. If BP has all its, road shows and outreach things, and you're engaging teachers and kids and parents and that kind of stuff, and then you've got, General Electric has theirs, and then you've got IBM has theirs, and then you've got, Shell has. If we all go in independently and do our thing, it becomes just a blitzkrieg of information, and teachers and others just kind of don't know who to deal with. So the more that there is coordination, so that we can work together on pooling our resources to help to engage people in the importance of these topics, and in pursuing careers that can solve some of the world's biggest challenges, in my mind anyway, the better. And striking that balance is difficult. It's an unnatural behaviour. You'll know from your past, you're competitive and you go in there and you want to wave your brand around the place, but actually in engaging kids right the way through to ones under the age of 10 in the possibilities for them, the exciting things you can do in the world. We have so much in common to do together on that, and we've just got to be careful about the balance between competition and collaboration.
Great. I've seen at least two people who want to speak. Three now. Yes, in the front row. We need a microphone here. Please identify yourself.
Martin Wilhelm, Geopolis Energy. If you look at the various players you described, Carol, what they're really trying to do is break the basic assumptions underlying your long-term projections, right? They're trying. If you take the history of cost reductions in renewables, advanced batteries, etc., and extrapolate that for over 30 years, you guys try to make that obsolete, right? So my question is, how do you deal with that? Because obviously, it's by definition, you can't necessarily model what you guys are doing, because otherwise you might as well do it. But it's hugely important for a company like BP from a strategic point of view. So you build scenarios or whatever. And the related question is, talking about countries, do you have a view with what you said about the U.S. innovation system versus the European one and Germany. Do you have a view whether those types of breakthrough innovations are much more likely to come from one region like the US than places like Europe? I mean, I've tried to convince, with a number of friends here in the US, convince European leaders to do something like European or German RPI, and it seems politically very hard, to put it mildly. And then maybe last point, do you have a view on China in that respect, where they're going?
Put simply, I guarantee what I showed you is wrong. I mean, absolutely guarantee it, and it's certainly not a prediction. On the other hand, we do find it helpful to put together what plausibly could happen, and we also analyze the uncertainties in that. We put in the things that could be transformational. You just don't know whether they will or not, because at a high level, some of those comparisons are quite difficult to break, and to some extent that then sets up the challenge for research systems and others to, if you really want to change the world's energy system, you're going to have to crack something here that's really quite difficult to crack. So that's a comment on the first one. In terms of where great breakthroughs are going to come from. It's really difficult. They're frequently these days coming from unusual combinations of different, completely different sectors and systems. And you have to invest heavily in, and I can remember a case in BP when we had an idea that biology and reservoir engineering could be a fantastic combination. And getting biologists to speak the same language as reservoir engineers is practically impossible. I mean, you can talk past each other for ages until you eventually begin to understand one another, and then great things can come about. So it's often at these interfaces that the really exciting stuff happens, and it's very unpredictable where that's going to occur. There's a very important sort of human personal dynamic. I digress slightly, but I remember asking the Nobel Prize winners organization, the Karolinska Institute, what do all the Nobel Prize winners have in common? And the answer was they're brilliant. They've been supported over many, many years to do their thing sort of against the odds. It seemed odd, but they were supported. And the third one was they're peripatetic. They get around the place. They go to places that they get experience to different. So effectively, you're trying to set up that circumstance. And as to where they'll come from, I think Carol said it brilliantly in her first picture. It's not just about research. It's about the economic and policy system into which that goes. And if you look at something like, what Alibaba can do in China, sure, there's some quite clever data analytics and some big data going on underneath that. But the position it's established, by, its market power, quite extraordinary what it can do. And lots of innovation going on in that space. Now, that's not just about a research-led innovation. That's the whole business model innovation and the strong market and policy context there. So you've got to look for all these things to find where the really big breakthroughs could come through, not just the piece of research that you think could be it for solid state batteries or whatever it is the most recent thing. So impossible, of course, to answer your question, but you've got to look at the whole system, not just the individual in the university or the lab that's got the answer.
Carol?
I would add to both parts or a couple parts of that question, echoing David's point that you're not any good at these future scenarios and forecasts unless you know going in that you're wrong. So you do your best to make some base predictions, and then you run a bunch of scenarios and sensitivity tests. We have a case that we know is not true that we run at the EIA, which is there won't be any policy changes. But you have to at least run with, well, let's go steady state with what we are, and just the general, cost curves come down because as you deploy more, they get a little bit better. And then we run some, what if there aren't as many oil and gas resources and the other things take off, and vice versa? What if technology breakthroughs are big? You just have to run a bunch of scenarios and look at it. On the comparing different country systems and how they work, I'm notwithstanding some of my exaggerated or catty remarks on the national labs, I am proud and absolutely convinced of the U.S.'s ability to both have breakthroughs in innovation and commercialize the technology. I think we're probably, world class at that. What I see in the cost curves on that, while the breakthroughs may come in different places, I also think the U.S. can commercialize the technology. What I see China having an advantage in because of their different system of government is that they have really driven down costs through deployment. Germany did as well on solar cells, and then China really did on manufacturing the solar cells. And one of the things that I look at BP's predictions, and granted, he says he knows they're wrong, but I look at the ones on storage, particularly grid storage, and think that they may be pessimistic on what could happen with grid storage, because given what China is looking at with EVs, and lithium ion isn't the one you'd probably predict for grid storage, but if they go at the pace that they're talking about with EVs, the cost curve may get down to where that they are more competitive, and there also could be some major breakthrough in flow batteries. So I remain optimistic because I know that technology is needed, that there may be some breakthroughs. The market signals are there that that's a desired technology, and there are things going on in China that may bring it about for a different reason, and hopefully innovation will bring it about for a deliberate reason.
Carol, feel free not to answer this question, but once you get beyond ideological and maybe exaggerated statements in various areas from the administration, do you see any material changes in the work that your laboratories are doing over the past 15 months?
Well, for one thing, it's one of those longer time horizons. So you have to recognize with the government that the budgets for the fiscal year that we're in now were set a couple years ago. Most of the money goes out through competitive grants that take a year or so to compete. So you wouldn't see dramatic changes quite this quickly, even if there were huge philosophical changes. I've now been in 3 administrations, Republican, Democratic, and Republican again. There are some nuances. Certainly in the first administration I joined was, let's do lots of commercialization of technology. The Democratic administration said, more of the fundamental and research and less money in deployment. Actually, in this administration, the signals are more about early stage research, and again, less about deployment. So it's not always similar with a party even. I see that both administrations, the Democratic and then the current Republican administration, were both big supporters of nuclear energy. Maybe talk about it differently, but there are some similarities there. Different emphasis on the reliability in the grid system, extremely important to both administrations. Slightly different spin on what the fixes are to the problems, but I have not seen a huge change.
Okay, good. Geir Westgard from Statoil, which is a company that's also been very progressive in new technologies.
Thank you very much, and thank you both for fascinating presentations and a discussion. My question is for you, Carol. Are there distinct differences between how the Department of Energy and, say, the Department of Defense manage this innovation ecosystem? And to what extent do you share learnings, best practices across the federal government in this particular space?
So there are indeed dramatic differences between how the Department of Defense and the Department of Energy do innovation. One of the biggest reasons for that, and we saw it, see Colin in the audience who worked on this project with us when he was in DOE, when we were doing a quadrennial energy review, which was the policy review. And in fact, we went to a number of other agencies that had done these 4-year policy or technology reviews and asked what had worked for them. And in talking to the DoD, which is known for one of the best processes on this and really good at implementing their report once it's done, is that they had, okay, in my opinion, they had some real advantages in their process that the DOE doesn't have. So the DoD is developing technology for itself as the customer. So you have a lot more control if you're like, this is the technology I need, now I'm going to put in programs to pay for its development. Whereas when we did an energy policy review, for one thing, it's not the Department of Energy that would do an energy review, because Interior is involved, and EPA is involved, and DOT is involved. There were like 13 agencies that we went to just to touch all the agencies that do something with energy policy, and none of us are the customer. So a lot more complex, and I think the track record of could we implement exactly what we wrote and said what was needed is probably not as good on that, but for, I think, completely understandable reasons. So you hear people talk about the different reviews and how, like clockwork, like military precision with the DoD process, but the internal controls in that, and most of their difficulty they had, and we did learn from them on how does the Navy interact with the Army, and so we got some lessons from that on how we interact with Department of Interior, Department of Transportation, and some things like that. But just quite a different subject matter. But DoD is very good at developing and commercializing their technology for themselves.
That's really interesting. I mean, we've just on what we do, we've seen similar kinds of things that DoD looks at climate change, for example, but in a very focused way. What effect does it have on troops in forward positions?
And we're looking
what's the effect going to be on Norfolk or Charleston or on desert training, you know, that kind of thing. Do you have any comment on any of this?
No, I agree totally with what Carol said about the DoD. It's just the same in the UK. I mean, it's a very different way of operating from the Department of Energy.
There was a hand over, there was Mr. Hershey, but there was previously a hand behind, if the person is still there. No? Okay, I first saw your hand and then Mr. Hershey.
Good morning, I'm Madhav Acharya with ARPA-E. So I actually agree with the comments you said about developing technologies internally. With DARPA, it's a very different ballgame than with ARPA-E. My question is actually for David. You mentioned very rightly that decarbonizing transportation and other sectors is a lot more challenging than the power sector. I was curious on what you think the state of refining would look like, say, in 2050 or beyond, as some of the products of refining are no longer necessary, but the others are. What happens to a refinery? I know BP still has 11 refineries on your books. So what do you see happening to refining in general?
Well, the first thing to say is that that's a long, long way away. And under almost any scenario, including ones that are very ambitious in terms of carbon in the atmosphere, there's still quite significant demand for crude-based products 2050 and beyond. And so clearly that they will continue to serve what is currently a growing market, but I mean eventually at some point in time we expect it to turn around and go down. They'll continue to serve that marketplace, and hopefully if they're one of the better operations, then they can still compete into that marketplace. It's a margin business, so I mean, you know, you've just got to be better than the other people in order to be able to make money. And what's interesting about our refineries is they are beginning to increasingly process biocomponents. And it is actually entirely possible that you can end up with a biorefining system that looks not too different from your current refining system. I mean, whether it won't necessarily be exactly the same, because when you're tapped into a biological system, it tends to be more distributed, and so you tend to have processing closer to the where you grow it, and you then have more consolidated or concentrated processing in the larger facilities. But as I say, in my talk, I think it's going to be really difficult to come up with alternatives to putting something like jet fuel into aircraft, because it is uniquely stable at atmospheric conditions. It doesn't freeze at minus 60 or whatever, as high as you can go, and we've got a massive system in place. So the question that we're wrestling with is how do you make that a renewable product rather than a fossil-based product for the very long term. I mean, you can contemplate things like hydrogen, and we handle a lot of hydrogen as well, but that has its own challenges, and we're not yet, I think, there at the point of saying, oh yes, you know, we know how we would run a hydrogen system. I might venture to suggest to you that in fact one of the best carriers for hydrogen is carbon. And the only thing is you don't want that carbon to come from underground, but you can source carbon elsewhere. It's a fantastic molecule. It's the building block of life. So we see all sorts of opportunities for our refining system going a long way out into the future. But obviously they're going to be focused on increasingly, you know, reducing their own emissions and improving the footprint of the products that they make, just like every other part of BP in our case.
Mr. Hershey, we have a microphone for you.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consultant. Could you tell us more about the storage efforts, particularly things like flow batteries and other newer technologies?
Do you want to start?
Actually, I don't have a huge insight into what we're doing with our current technologies. I'm in the policy group right now. At least within the policy team, we're looking at what would it take to price the market in a way that would compensate storage. It's not really what you asked, but that's more what I'm working on these days. RPE may have some insights on what we're doing on storage, but I know that the cost curves that David showed on lithium-ion batteries are the same ones that we look at, and those costs are coming down dramatically, and I see deployment continuing to improve those.
I mean, I would only add that, I mean, I get approached by somebody in a lab somewhere on a weekly basis by, you know, a new breakthrough battery technology, and some of them turn out to be breaking the laws of physics, and others turn out to be really quite interesting. I think the important point to note is there are very many different applications. I mean, there are lots of different kinds of batteries or capacitors or whatever you want, and they have different applications in the world's energy system. So this is not a one-size-fits-all answer. Our interest in BP, I mean, our main interest is in transport, because we're very vested, as the question from the upper E gentleman came forward suggests. We know we're big in the refining system. And when you look at transport, there is a massive challenge in both supplying vehicles with electricity, the system for that, as well as having them accept it at a pace, you know, at a way in that is going to be convenient for customers. So fast chargeable batteries is a really big challenge. To have one that you can charge up in less than 10 minutes, that's got a range of more than 300 miles, managing that safely is quite difficult. And then actually just the local system that puts power into these vehicles at the rate necessary is also quite challenging. You need your own mini power station to hand where we've currently got retail systems. And just to make the point quite emphatically, when you put your hose in your tank, with gasoline, it's going in at a rate of roughly 19 megawatts when you pour it into the tank. Now, you're not going to, I don't think, going to have a 19 megawatt supply to a vehicle, but we are certainly looking at hundreds of kilowatts, and that's quite challenging to deliver that at scale with the same throughput of vehicles on our forecourts that we have today with electricity rather than with hydrocarbons. That's a big challenge, and so we're working hard on fast charging, both fast chargeable batteries in the vehicles, working with a number of manufacturers on that, as well as fast charging systems for which the grids and the substations just aren't set up today at all.
One of our fellows, Phil Cornell, has a question.
Thanks very much. You both talked a little bit about the uncertainty that comes along with forecasting, particularly when it comes to technology. After some time at the IEA and also Aramco working in market analysis, I very much appreciate that. One thing that we were always very interested in is, how you actually wrap your head around that uncertainty. So, at what points, for example, do you see does it become much clearer what the curve looks like, for example, over the next decade? So maybe a little bit to David, I would say, when we're looking at the penetration, let's say, of electric vehicles in light-duty vehicles and personal ownership, what are the kind of points that you see coming in, whether they be dates or specific technologies or whatever, that will let us know where you think you'll gain a lot more clarity over what the penetration rates over the next 10 years kind of look like? Does that make sense?
Well, it's a very good question. I think we're back into the inability to predict the future aspects of things. I mean, actually, the thing that we are probably most interested in is something that's non-technological, and that is consumers' behavior, particularly around transport, and how many people are happy to do away with owning a vehicle and just use a service in the future. That seems to me to be quite unclear, frankly. I mean, electric or not, it's just a vehicle, and people don't really care what's under the hood in some respects, until it starts to impact their way of life and the convenience of it, and then it really matters to them. So are people going to, are we going to have autonomous vehicles? Is that going to drive, and are people going to be comfortable going in them? How fast is that going to drive down the cost of transport if they don't own it, but it's owned as a high utilization service to them? I mean, those sorts of things can make a huge difference to the trajectory of the application of these technologies that have nothing to do with the actual technology and have an awful lot to do with consumer acceptance. And all the analysis I've seen suggests that that varies very significantly around the world. And what's more, can be changed significantly by an event. And so that's one of the hardest things to get your mind around. And so looking for those inflection points when it seems as though human consumer behavior is prepared to go with or will go against a technology can be profound in their impact on the trajectory, and more so perhaps than the steady incremental generally and sometimes transformational changes in the technologies themselves. So we're looking more at that. We're looking more at what the customers really, really want. And when you've only got 1 or 2% penetrations in systems, you haven't got a clear customer signal. You know what the leading adopters want and how they behave. You don't know how the mass public is going to respond to these things. That's what I would say that's what we're looking more at, as well as obviously looking at the technologies underneath it. It doesn't answer your question really, but it's not just about technology is the answer.
Yeah. You want to add something, Carol?
And I would just say that consumer choice is certainly important, but also looking at, as we mentioned before, China, where there's a bit more of a push on to the consumers, and to see if that works, and what you learn from that, for me, would be a signal. I may have turned my microphone off while throwing it on the ground.
We're just about out of time, but I think I saw 2 hands. Is that right? Michael, and why don't we take at the same time your question, the question of the person in front. So Michael Tritt.
Michael Tritt with Lane Power Energy Solutions. We're seeing an increasing amount of articles written on cobalt supply and the criticality of it and the limited resources that are known, proven resources that are known. Obviously, that's a key component to the current transportation batteries that are in use right now. Is two-part. How does that factor into your cost model? And two, what's in research right now, and when do you see kind of a step change in technology which would lessen demand on those rare earth metals?
Okay, and then the question from the front.
Zach Valdez, I'm a Science and Technology Policy Fellow with the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. I'm curious about how, typically in the past, especially for large petroleum companies, it's been about economies of scale, big projects, and it's moving more into this idea of being able to adapt to what's happening and having quick projects that turn around on the scale of 5 to 10 years instead of 25 years like offshore. Are there any things that you see looking forward where you're able to maneuver, maybe even within the DOE space, that are looking at shorter time periods to kind of get technology out and to get energy infrastructure or energy projects out on a shorter time scale?
Okay, well, let's answer those two questions. I might have one wrap-up question for your final, which will bring to your final comments. So,
I've got some stuff on cobalt. So we have been doing inside the Department of Energy, and in fact the government overall, there was an executive order looking at critical minerals. So we've been both working with the White House on a process for identifying not just cobalt, which is in the news, but what are the range of materials that are critical, what's the methodology. It's both looking at the supply and the demand and their importance, at least within the Department of Energy, their importance to different energy equipment. And what we then use that information for is directing research. So we're looking at both of these for cobalt. You both look at how can you use less of that critical material in the component that it's a part of, in this instance batteries. So we have some research grants that we've been given out to try to find solutions for that. We also look for substitutes, and it's more of a watching situation, but we also watch the market for, are there additional sources of supply coming online, so that we adjust our forecast. I think we do it like every couple years to look and see. We may be publishing our latest version on this in the next couple months. It's in the concurrence process now, but looking at what minerals from when we did it in 2011 or 12 might not be on our watch list now, and which new ones have been added. So we do have a supply chain and critical materials part of our research portfolio.
Not the
well, I mean,
projects or whatever.
Cobalt is, a fairly special element in the periodic table, but fortunately we have the whole periodic table to play with, and there are definitely there are alternatives, and it's a challenged product because of its source in Africa. I think there'll always be a place for big projects because they often have huge economies of scale. And they may relate more to baseload than not. But I mean, big projects are something I think that will continue in the world of energy. And the world of energy is very, very big, and it requires enormous amounts of money. I said roughly $500 billion a year just in oil and gas alone. And so there's going to be a space in that massive portfolio for big projects that are advantaged. As far as smaller, quick turnaround projects, and we would want to have some of that in our portfolio. And so we want to have a balance between the big ones, which have got very low cost supply, very stable, and we want to have ones that we can be much more nimble about how we execute them, that we like having that mixture. It actually enables us to be more flexible to circumstances. But I'd also say that agility, lean ways of developing businesses is also a way of thinking and a way of being. And being able to move quickly yourself and have the methods to be able to move quickly and develop a viable product, minimum viable product, test it, move on, I think is also a way of being as a company. Certainly we're trying to get much quicker at the way we develop products inside BP or demonstrate the next step in the process rather than viewing them as big, long programs. So I think it's both something you want to have in your portfolio as a project, but also a way of being that we're certainly focusing on quite a lot.
Great. Let me ask one sort of wrap-up question and maybe tie into any final comments that you have. you've both made extraordinarily rational presentations. You've presented, for example, projections into the future as to cost with respect to various, potential sources of energy. The question is, using your imagination, where do you really think things will be around 2050? If you can, again, taking off maybe a little bit of the irrational side, but or any other final comments, and then we'll close it off.
I don't know. I have mainly colleagues criticizing me for really using logic here again, because it doesn't always work where I am. But I have a little trouble getting out of my completely rational and logical space. I hope that we're moving forward in both plentiful and cleaner energy. I see the rationality of, the carbon tax, but the idea that we'd get the same policy instrument in multiple countries, I have not seen that yet. So I'm not optimistic about it going forward. I am optimistic more on we kind of find our way in incremental steps unique to different countries. China is moving ahead in a way that I could not have guessed 10 years ago when I would visit China and foolishly try to jog and end up back in the hotel, coughing my lungs out. That they're deploying more renewable power now than anywhere else in the world, and moving into EVs in a huge way is not what I would have guessed, but I like being pleasantly surprised.
Great. Last comments, David?
Our analysis suggests that we can see our way to technology by itself without any help eating half the problem relative to the sorts of goals people signed up for in Paris. But it can't get you the whole way there. It'll get you a long way there, can't get you the whole way there. And so you need something else to get you there. I think the citizens of the world, especially the young people that we were talking about, are pretty clear the kind of world that they want to see. So I think at the end of the day, it's pretty clear where they're going to head. And so I'm with Carol in as much as I think the imagination that we need to exercise is the imagination of great leadership that will succeed in acting in the interests of future generations today, which is a difficult thing to do politically. But that's where the rest of the solution lies, and whether the world's leaders can act consistent with their commitments, I think, is the thing that we all hope and expect, actually, from them that they will do. That's where my imagination gets most vivid.
That's great. Great answers both. I want to also, before thanking our panelists and speakers, thank the audience. Terrific questions, and thank you both for exceptional presentations. So let's give both of our
Thanks for having us.
Lovely doing this with you.
Good to see you again.
Fantastic. That's good.